Madeline could feel the heat radiating from Ivy's body as she carried her down the cracked pavement, her little arms limp, her cheek pressed against Madeline's shoulder. The girl's breath was shallow, her whimper barely audible over the noise of the city that never seemed to sleep. The urgency pulsed through Madeline's veins, stronger than her exhaustion, stronger than the panic that curled in her chest. She just had to get to the hospital. That was all that mattered. Everything else, her aching feet, the sweat sticking her hair to her neck, the knot of hunger twisting in her stomach, was irrelevant. She reached the curb where her old scooter sat, leaning like an old dog too tired to get up. She shifted Ivy in her arms and fumbled for the keys, hands trembling as she tried to jam them into the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. She turned the key again. A weak groan of protest, then nothing. She let out a breath, her throat tight. Not now. Not tonight. She tried again. Silence. A frustrated tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't have time for tears. She glanced up, scanning the street. The bus stop was a block away, but even if one was running at this hour, she didn't have enough for the fare. A cab? Out of the question. Maybe if she flagged someone down, no. She'd done that before, begged strangers for help when Ivy was a baby, and she still remembered the way they looked at her. Some apologetic, some wary, some pretending not to hear. Her pulse pounded against her skull. She had to think. She had to move. Then she saw it. A motorcycle. Sleek, black, powerful. It was parked outside an upscale lounge, the kind of place that had tinted windows and velvet ropes and people who never worried about things like bus fare. A helmet hung from the handlebar, swinging slightly in the warm breeze. The keys. The keys were in the ignition. Her mind rejected the idea before it could fully form. Absolutely not. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't reckless. But then Ivy let out a weak cough, her tiny body twitching in Madeline's arms. The sound sent something sharp and desperate shooting through her chest. She looked back at the scooter, dead and useless. Then at the motorcycle, gleaming under the streetlights like it had been placed there just for her. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts. This was insane. This was her only option. She ran. Her heart was a drumbeat in her ears as she closed the distance, eyes darting to the lounge doors. No security guards. No furious owner storming out. She shifted Ivy's weight carefully, using one hand to grab the note from her pocket, her fingers barely able to form letters as she scrawled on the back of an old grocery receipt, "I'm sorry. My daughter is sick. I'll return it." She folded it quickly and shoved it under the handlebar. She had no idea how to ride a motorcycle. She'd been on the back of one once when she was 19, gripping some boy's leather jacket like her life depended on it, which it kind of did. That was her entire knowledge base. But it had to be like a scooter, just bigger. More powerful. More terrifying. She swung her leg over, cradling Ivy against her as she gripped the handlebars. The bike was heavier than she expected, solid and foreign under her fingers. She forced her breathing to slow, reached for the throttle, and twisted. The motorcycle roared to life beneath her, and Ivy stirred, her fevered face pressing against Madeline's chest. "Mama?" Madeline closed her eyes briefly. "I've got you, baby." Then she hit the gas. The bike lurched forward, and for a split second, she thought she'd made a huge mistake. The force nearly sent her toppling sideways, but she adjusted, gripping the handlebars tighter as she swerved into the street. The rush of wind tore through her hair, the city flashing past in streaks of neon and headlights. The bike was fast. Too fast. She eased off the throttle, forcing herself to focus. The streets were mostly empty, but stoplights still glowed red, each one stretching the distance between her and the hospital. The wind howled in Madeline's ears as the motorcycle surged forward, her fingers locked in a death grip around the handlebars. The city blurred around her, streaks of neon and streetlights flashing in her periphery. Ivy's small, feverish body was pressed against her, tucked safely between her arms and the gas tank. She could feel the heat radiating from her daughter's skin even through the thick fabric of her hoodie. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs, faster than the machine beneath her. She didn't know how fast she was going. Fast enough that the road signs were unreadable, fast enough that every pothole sent a jolt through her spine. The sheer force of the engine was nothing like the scooter she was used to. This was an animal, growling beneath her, threatening to throw her off with every slight shift of her weight. But she couldn't slow down. The hospital was still miles away. Ivy let out a tiny whimper, barely audible over the roar of the wind, and Madeline swallowed against the lump in her throat. Just a few more minutes. They just had to hold on. A red light appeared up ahead. She squeezed the brakes too hard, and the back wheel skidded, fishtailing across the slick pavement. The world tilted violently. The motorcycle wobbled, veering dangerously toward the curb, and for a terrifying second, she thought they were going to crash. She yanked the handlebars, her muscles screaming as she fought against the weight of the bike. The tires caught traction at the last second, jerking them back onto the road. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but she didn't stop. The light turned green, and she twisted the throttle, sending them flying forward again. She didn't dare check how many traffic laws she was breaking. She cut through empty lanes, zipped past parked cars, ignored the blare of an angry horn as she barely avoided sideswiping a sedan. The helmet, too big for her head, slipped down over her eyes, and she had to jerk it back up with one shaking hand. A sharp left turn nearly sent her crashing into a dumpster, and she barely corrected in time. This was madness. She had no idea what she was doing, but stopping wasn't an option. She clutched Ivy tighter, whispering, "Almost there, baby." The hospital's glowing sign appeared in the distance. The sight of it sent a rush of relief through her so strong she nearly sobbed. She pressed harder on the gas, the final stretch blurring past her in a haze of streetlights and exhaustion. The emergency entrance was coming up fast. Too fast. She yanked the brakes again, this time more carefully, and the motorcycle screeched to a halt just outside the doors. The sudden stop sent her lurching forward, and for a split second, she thought they might topple over. She scrambled to plant her foot on the ground, steadying the bike just in time. Her hands were shaking as she switched off the engine. The silence that followed was almost deafening. She unwrapped her arms from Ivy and slid off the bike, her legs unsteady beneath her. A nurse pushing a wheelchair stopped mid-stride, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Another staff member turned, startled, as Madeline clutched Ivy's limp body and staggered forward. She's burning up," Madeline gasped, voice hoarse. "Please, The nurse sprang into action, taking Ivy from her arms and rushing her through the sliding doors. Someone else appeared beside Madeline, guiding her forward, but her body refused to move. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself against the reception desk, fingers gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. It was over. Ivy was in good hands. She had made it. And now, the full weight of what she had just done came crashing down on her. She had stolen a motorcycle. A very expensive one. A motorcycle that was now parked outside a hospital under security cameras, sitting there like evidence waiting to be collected. Her stomach twisted painfully. She was going to get arrested. The thought hit her like a slap. She had been so focused on Ivy, so frantic to get to the hospital, that she hadn't thought beyond that. But now that she wasn't moving, wasn't fighting the machine for control, wasn't dodging traffic, the reality of her actions settled like a lead weight in her chest. She turned, her eyes locking onto the gleaming black motorcycle just outside the doors. The note was still there, pinned under the handlebar. A ridiculous, flimsy excuse for what she'd done. A pathetic attempt to make it seem less like a crime. Her breath came in uneven gasps. What had she done? Leo Bennett had spent the last 3 hours at a business launch event he hadn't wanted to attend in the first place. He had shaken hands with investors who thought they understood technology, endured speeches about innovation delivered by people who still used their assistants to print out emails, and smiled through conversations that were really just attempts to get him to fund someone's next overpriced startup. The only thing that had made the evening bearable was knowing that, soon, he would leave, hop onto his motorcycle, and feel something real for the first time all night. He slipped past the last of the eager networkers, giving his security detail a nod that meant he was ready to go. They moved efficiently, escorting him through the private exit toward the parking lot, where his bike should have been waiting. The crisp night air was a relief after hours of being trapped in a ballroom that smelled like expensive cologne and desperation. He reached for his helmet, ready to shake off the evening with speed and adrenaline. But his helmet wasn't there. Neither was his motorcycle. His steps slowed. He scanned the parking lot, frowning as he turned to his head of security. Where is it? The man's expression barely shifted, but Leo caught the slight hesitation before he responded. There was an incident. Leo's patience, already worn thin from the evening, snapped. An incident, he repeated, his voice flat. We were just about to inform you. Now's a great time. The man cleared his throat, pulling out a tablet and tapping through the security feed. The vehicle was taken approximately 30 minutes ago by an unidentified woman. We were tracking the situation before reporting it to insure. Someone stole my bike, and you were insuring? He snatched the tablet before the man could offer another excuse, pressing play on the footage. The screen showed the sleek black machine, parked exactly where he had left it. Then, a figure entered the frame, small, frantic, moving fast. A woman, dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail, carrying something in her arms. No, not something. Someone. A child. Leo's frown deepened. He watched as the woman hesitated for half a second, glanced around, and then made the single worst decision possible. She swung onto his motorcycle with all the grace of someone who had no idea what they were doing, secured the kid between her arms, and gunned the engine. The bike shot forward. She wobbled but didn't fall. Instead, she tore through the parking lot, disappearing into the night. Leo replayed the footage, zooming in on her face. She looked exhausted. Not the kind of exhaustion that came from a bad day, but the kind that settled in your bones. And desperate. There was something in the way she moved, the way she clutched the child, the way she didn't hesitate once she made up her mind. Still, none of that changed the fact that she had stolen from him. He tossed the tablet back to his security chief. Find the bike. The man nodded. Should we involve law enforcement? Leo exhaled sharply. He should say yes. That was the logical answer. But something about the footage made him pause. She wasn't a thief. Not really. She hadn't planned this. And if she was desperate enough to steal in a moment like that, she probably had bigger problems than Grand Theft Auto. No police. Just track it. He walked toward the waiting car, sliding into the back seat as his driver pulled away from the curb. He should have been furious. He should have been drafting the press statement about how crime was out of control. Instead, he just sat there, arms crossed, wondering what kind of woman saw a multi-million-dollar motorcycle and thought, yes, that's a reasonable getaway vehicle. By the time the sun rose, he had his answer. His phone buzzed as he sipped his morning coffee, scrolling absent-mindedly through his schedule. His security team had finally tracked down the motorcycle. It had been found parked outside a hospital. And that wasn't the most interesting part. A note had been left on the seat, scrawled onto the back of an old receipt, written in rushed, uneven handwriting. I'm sorry. My daughter is sick. I'll return it. Leo read the words twice. Then again. The irritation he had felt last night shifted into something else, something more curious than angry. This wasn't over. Not even close. Leo had spent years making decisions that left people confused, but this was probably in his personal top 5. Any rational person would have called the police. He had the security footage, the note, and a missing vehicle that had been tracked down at a hospital. Open and shut case. But something about that rushed, scribbled apology made him hesitate. It wasn't the work of a seasoned criminal. It was a mother, desperate enough to steal the least practical getaway vehicle in history because she had no other choice. He wasn't sure whether that made her reckless or resourceful. Either way, he wanted to meet her. The apartment complex was the kind of place that landlords described as up and coming, when what they really meant was barely holding together. The hallway smelled like burnt toast and cheap air freshener, and a flickering light overhead made everything look vaguely ominous. Leo knocked once, sharp and firm. He heard movement inside, slow, hesitant. Then, silence. He knocked again. The door creaked open an inch, revealing a woman who looked exactly as he expected, exhausted, wary, and already bracing for the worst. Her dark eyes flicked from his face to his suit, then past him, scanning the hallway like she expected a full SWAT team to be standing behind him. Madeline Reyes? Her fingers tightened on the edge of the door. Who's asking? Leo Bennett. The name landed with visible weight. Her posture stiffened. She knew exactly who he was. Her grip on the door shifted like she was about to slam it shut, but he was faster, pressing one hand against the frame. If you're thinking about running, don't. I know where you live, and honestly, I'm very fast. She exhaled sharply. You here to have me arrested? That depends. On what? On whether or not you're willing to negotiate. She hesitated, confusion flickering through her expression before she stepped back, opening the door wider. He took that as an invitation and stepped inside. The apartment was small. Not the kind of small that real estate agents described as cozy, but the kind where you could stand in the kitchen, living room, and entryway all at once. It was cluttered but not messy, kids' drawings taped to the fridge, a pile of folded laundry on the couch, a stuffed rabbit with one missing ear perched on a bookshelf. Ivy was asleep in a nest of blankets on the mattress in the corner, her tiny face still flushed, her breathing slow but steady. Madeline closed the door and crossed her arms. If you're not here to call the cops, what do you want? Leo glanced at the sleeping child, then back at her. How's she doing? The question threw her off balance. She blinked, defensive walls faltering for just a second. She'll be okay. He nodded, then pulled the crumpled note from his pocket and held it up between 2 fingers. I assume this is yours? She swallowed hard. Look, I know what I did was insane. She huffed. I was going to say illegal. Also true. He folded the note neatly and tucked it away. But I have a proposition. Her shoulders lifted with tension. I'm not interested in whatever deal you're offering. You don't even know what it is yet. I'm not stupid. You're a billionaire, and I stole from you. There's only one way this ends, and it involves me getting a lawyer I can't afford. Leo slid his hands into his pockets and leaned against the wall. Not necessarily. She studied him, suspicious. Why are you here? Because you fascinate me. She made a face. That's unsettling. I mean it, he said. You could have stolen a car. You could have called an ambulance. Hell, you could have broken into the hospital and carried her straight through the doors. But instead, you took my motorcycle, something you clearly don't know how to drive, and then left a note. That kind of impulsive problem solving is either brilliant or reckless, and I can't quite decide which. She crossed her arms tighter. Are you waiting for me to say thank you? No, he said, tilting his head. I'm waiting for you to say yes. She narrowed her eyes. Yes to what? To working for me. The words landed like a punchline. She stared at him, deadpan. Are you having a stroke? Not currently. You want me to work for you? Doing what? Security training? Testing your alarm systems by seeing if I can steal other vehicles? He smirked. Not a bad idea, but no. Then what? He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen, turning it toward her. This. She squinted. What am I looking at? My company is launching a new AI assistant software. We need real-world testing before the final release. And since you seem to make unconventional decisions under pressure, I think you'd be useful. Her eyes narrowed. You want me to talk to some fancy robot in exchange for not pressing charges? More or less. That's blackmail. It's a job offer, he corrected. With pay. She gave him a skeptical look. And what exactly would this job involve? You'd run daily tests, interact with the AI, and give feedback on its performance. Basically, you'd use it the way a normal person would. Define normal. Someone who's not a tech billionaire, he said dryly. Look, this is a chance to get paid to talk to a piece of software instead of spending the next year tangled up in legal battles. Seems like an easy choice. She pressed her lips together, clearly weighing her options. And if I say no? Then I call my lawyers and let them decide what happens next. She muttered something under her breath that sounded like a very creative insult. Then she sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. Fine. But only because Ivy needs me, and I can't take care of her from jail. Smart decision, Leo said. I'll send over the paperwork. She rolled her eyes. Can't wait. Leo pushed off the wall, heading for the door. He paused before leaving, glancing over his shoulder. By the way, if you ever steal my motorcycle again. She raised an eyebrow. You'll call the cops? He smirked. No. I'll make you my head of security. Then he walked out, leaving Madeline staring after him like she couldn't decide if she'd just made the worst mistake of her life, or the best. Madeline had made a lot of questionable decisions in her life, but this one was definitely in the top 3. Maybe even top 2, right behind the time she had tried to fix her broken oven with duct tape and nearly set her entire kitchen on fire. She stood in the middle of a sleek, glass-walled office, feeling like an alien who had accidentally wandered onto the set of a sci-fi movie. Everything around her hummed with technology, monitors the size of dining tables, voice-activated doors, desks that adjusted height when someone so much as looked at them funny. Even the coffee machine looked like it required an advanced engineering degree. Leo stood beside her, his arms crossed, watching her like she was an unpredictable lab experiment. Do you always look this overwhelmed, or is today special? She shot him a glare. I'm not overwhelmed. I'm absorbing. He smirked. Right. Well, absorb quickly. You start now. A woman with perfectly styled hair and an efficiency level that made Madeline nervous appeared from nowhere and handed her a tablet. This is your interface, the woman said. All interactions with the AI assistant will be logged here. You'll run diagnostics, stress test responses, and report any anomalies. Madeline blinked at her. Right. Of course. And, by interface, you mean this thing that looks suspiciously like an iPad? The woman barely concealed her sigh before walking away, muttering something about how she didn't have time for this. Madeline turned to Leo. So, just to clarify, I talk to a robot, it talks back, and then I tell you if it's being weird? More or less, he said. Fantastic. Should be a breeze. It was not a breeze. The AI assistant, named Nova, was polite. Too polite. Every time Madeline asked a question, Nova responded with an absurd amount of detail, like it was trying to write an encyclopedia in real time. Hey, Nova, what's the weather today? The current temperature is 76 degrees Fahrenheit with a humidity level of. Okay, great, no need for the science lecture. Would you like a simplified response? Yes, please. The weather is nice. Madeline frowned. All right, now you're just mocking me. Leo, who had been observing from his desk, sighed. Nova is designed to adapt. If it's being sarcastic, that means it thinks that's what you want. I don't want sass from a robot, she said, glaring at the screen. I get enough of that from my kid. Then stop feeding it sarcasm. I'm not feeding it anything. It's just, ugh. She turned back to the tablet. Nova, can you tell me the time without making a production out of it? The time is 10:37 a.m. See? Much better. Leo was staring at her, arms still crossed, expression unreadable. What? She asked. You adjusted your approach without thinking about it. She raised an eyebrow. Yeah? Because I have a functioning brain? He ignored the sarcasm. Most people, when frustrated with the AI, either shut down or get aggressive. You instinctively found a middle ground. Well, congratulations. You hired a person who knows how to talk to a voice assistant. It's not just a voice assistant, he said, as if the idea personally offended him. It's a machine learning interface designed to anticipate and respond like a human. Which means you just did, in 5 minutes, what takes most developers days. She narrowed her eyes. Are you saying I'm good at this? I'm saying you might not be entirely useless. It was the closest thing to a compliment she figured she'd get, so she rolled with it. An hour later, things had somehow gotten worse. Nova had shut down twice. The tablet had restarted itself with no warning. The automatic blinds had glitched, leaving Madeline trapped in a strangely dramatic lighting setup, and at one point, she had triggered an emergency lockdown by accidentally setting her coffee cup too close to a sensor. Leo, to his credit, only sighed once. You're a menace, he muttered. You should have known that when I stole your motorcycle. He didn't disagree. By the time lunch rolled around, Madeline was mentally drained. She slumped into a chair in the break room, staring at the high-tech vending machine like it was her personal nemesis. Leo sat across from her, watching as she struggled to figure out how to retrieve the protein bar she had just paid for. Do I need a degree for this, too? She muttered, jabbing at the touchscreen. He reached over, tapped 2 buttons, and the machine whirred, spitting the bar into the slot. She gave him a look. I hate you. You're welcome. She unwrapped the bar and took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. So, is this your thing? Hiring people who have no idea what they're doing and seeing if they survive? Only you, he said. Lucky me. Leo leaned back, watching her with that unreadable expression again. I still don't understand why you took my motorcycle. She sighed, resting her chin in her hand. Ivy was sick. I was desperate. I didn't think, I just acted. You could have stolen something easier to drive. Yeah, well, there wasn't a convenient station wagon sitting there with the keys inside. He smirked. Fair point. She glanced at him. You don't seem as mad as you should be. Still deciding if I am. She studied him for a moment. You don't like people, do you? I like competent people. Then you must hate this. He huffed a quiet laugh. Not yet. She popped the last piece of the protein bar into her mouth and stood up. All right, boss. What's next? Leo checked his watch. Try not to break anything else before the day is over. No promises. He didn't look surprised. Madeline had been dreading this all morning. The meeting room was enormous, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that made her feel like she was about to give a TED Talk on how to ruin expensive technology. A sleek conference table stretched across the center, occupied by investors in perfectly tailored suits, each one staring expectantly at the massive screen mounted on the wall. Cameras were positioned in the corners, broadcasting the demonstration live to an audience of shareholders and tech journalists who, unbeknownst to them, were about to witness a disaster. Leo stood at the front, exuding his usual brand of effortless authority, looking completely unfazed. He gestured toward the screen, where the AI interface, Nova, was ready to show off its capabilities. And now, Leo said smoothly, we'll demonstrate how Nova's adaptive learning system can integrate seamlessly with any work environment. Madeline stood off to the side, holding the control tablet like a live grenade. Her job was simple: interact with Nova and showcase its practical applications. She could do that. Probably. She cleared her throat and pressed the button to activate the AI. Hey, Nova, let's run a task management test. The screen flickered. Of course, Madeline. What task would you like to complete? She glanced at the investors, who were watching with thinly veiled skepticism. Let's schedule a project update for next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Nova processed for a second. Then, in a calm, almost pleasant voice, it said, absolutely. Scheduling meeting, for the year 2097. Madeline's stomach dropped. Leo's head snapped toward her. The investors murmured. She frantically tapped the tablet. No, not 2097. Next week. Tuesday. Nova cheerfully responded, confirming 10 a.m., next Tuesday, the year 2097. A smirk twitched at the corner of one investor's mouth. Another scribbled something on a notepad. Leo's expression remained neutral, which somehow made it worse. Let's try again, Madeline said, forcing a laugh that she did not feel. Schedule a project update for. The screen cut to static. Then, with an alarming lack of hesitation, Nova announced, self-destruct sequence activated. A horrified silence fell over the room. Madeline froze. Leo inhaled sharply. The investors sat up straighter, some looking vaguely concerned, others highly amused. She forced a tight smile. That is not a real function. Just a joke. Right, Nova? Error, the AI responded. Counting down, 5, 4. Madeline lunged for the tablet, frantically pressing buttons. Cancel. Abort. Override. Leo's voice was quiet but sharp. Reyes. I'm handling it. Doesn't look like it. Maybe if your fancy robot wasn't trying to start World War III. The screen suddenly flickered, then reset. System reboot complete, Nova announced pleasantly. Good morning, Leo. Would you like to hear today's stock market updates? A stunned beat passed. Then one of the investors chuckled. Another leaned forward, intrigued. Leo slowly turned his head toward her. Explain. Madeline wiped a hand over her face. Okay, so maybe I accidentally triggered a debug mode with my request? Which, apparently, is coded to joke about nuclear annihilation. Which, let's be real, is very weird on your part. A man near the back smirked. Well, at least we know it has a sense of humor. A few investors laughed. The tension in the room loosened just slightly. Leo studied her. How did you fix it? She shrugged, still trying to get her pulse under control. It was looping through a failed execution command. I figured forcing a reset was the fastest way to kick it back into a standard function mode. One of the executives raised an eyebrow. You figured? Yeah, she said. Seemed logical. Leo's gaze lingered on her, unreadable. The rest of the meeting continued, and by some miracle, the AI did not attempt another simulated catastrophe. When it finally ended, the investors filed out, discussing Nova's learning capabilities with genuine interest. Madeline exhaled, gripping the tablet to keep her hands from shaking. Leo walked over, standing beside her in silence. So, she said, still recovering. How much trouble am I in? He glanced at her. You didn't crash the system. Low bar, but I'll take it. You handled it well. She blinked at him. Did you just, was that a compliment? A flicker of amusement passed through his eyes. Don't get used to it. Too late. Madeline was just beginning to feel like she was getting the hang of things when her phone buzzed, sending a sharp jolt of dread through her stomach. She barely had time to glance at the screen before it buzzed again. And again. She stepped away from her desk and answered in a hushed voice. Hello? Ms. Reyes? The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, and carrying the distinct tone of someone who had long since given up on optimism. This is Mrs. Garcia from Ivy's school. We need you to come in immediately. Madeline's breath caught. Is she okay? She isn't hurt, the woman said, which was not exactly the same as she's fine. But there's been an incident, and we need to discuss it in person. Madeline pinched the bridge of her nose. What kind of incident? A behavioral one. That could mean anything from throwing crayons to setting something on fire. Either way, Madeline wasn't about to debate over the phone. I'll be there as soon as I can. She hung up, already moving toward Leo's office. He was in the middle of typing something, eyes locked on the screen, when she knocked twice and pushed the door open. I need to leave. Leo didn't look up. Try again. She exhaled. I need to leave now. It's Ivy's school. There's a problem. That got his attention. He glanced at her, fingers pausing over the keyboard. Problem? She's not hurt, but they won't give me details over the phone. I have to go. Leo's mouth pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she braced for a fight. He had been tolerating her existence here, barely, but leaving in the middle of the day, unplanned, was pushing it. Instead, he just exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. Fine. Go. She blinked. Wait. That's it? He rubbed a hand over his jaw. Would you stay if I said no? Absolutely not. Then go. She hesitated. I'll come back later. Or work from home. Reyes. She straightened. Go. She did. The school was only a 10-minute drive away, but it felt longer. Her mind ran through all the possible reasons she had been called in, and none of them were good. Ivy was a sweet kid, but she was also stubborn, fiercely independent, and occasionally too smart for her own good. By the time Madeline pulled into the parking lot, her heart was racing. She hurried through the front doors, greeted with the familiar smell of glue sticks and vague cafeteria mystery food. Mrs. Garcia was waiting for her just past the front office, her expression unreadable. Thank you for coming, she said, already leading Madeline down the hall. Ivy is in the counselor's office. Madeline's stomach twisted. What happened? Mrs. Garcia sighed. She got into a disagreement with another student. Words were exchanged. Then, a chair may have been thrown. Madeline stopped walking. Thrown? Technically, pushed over in frustration. But it nearly hit another student, which is why we need to discuss next steps. Madeline let out a slow breath, willing herself not to panic. Can I talk to her? Mrs. Garcia nodded, stepping aside so she could enter the office. Ivy was sitting in a small plastic chair, arms crossed, her tiny face twisted in a scowl. A stuffed bear sat on the table in front of her, clearly an attempt to diffuse whatever storm was brewing inside her. Madeline knelt down. Hey, kiddo. Ivy glanced up, her eyes softening just a little. Hi, Mama. Madeline reached out, brushing a curl from her forehead. Want to tell me what happened? Ivy huffed. Jacob said I couldn't be an astronaut because I'm a girl. And also because I don't have a dad to take me to space camp. Madeline inhaled sharply. I see. So I told him that was dumb. And that I would go to space. And then I maybe accidentally knocked over a chair with my foot. Which maybe almost hit him. Madeline closed her eyes briefly, then looked at Ivy. I am very proud of you for standing up for yourself. And we will definitely be having a long talk about Jacob later. But we do not throw chairs. Ivy nodded solemnly. I understand. Mrs. Garcia stepped in. We're not suspending her, but we do need to reinforce that actions have consequences. Madeline sighed. Agreed. Thank you. When they finally left the office, Ivy tugged at Madeline's sleeve. Am I in trouble? Madeline scooped her up, pressing a kiss to her temple. You're in slight trouble. But mostly, we're going to talk about how you're going to be the best astronaut ever and prove Jacob completely wrong. Ivy grinned. Good. By the time they got home, Madeline was exhausted. She sent an email to Leo, letting him know she'd make up the missed time, and collapsed onto the couch, Ivy curled up next to her. Leo read the email. Deleted his drafted response. And instead, much to his own surprise, found himself staring at his phone, wondering why exactly he cared so much about an employee who had thrown his entire life off course. Madeline had never been good at keeping her mouth shut, especially when something didn't add up. And Leo Bennett, with his tailored suits and the kind of arrogance that only came from being a billionaire, didn't add up. She had assumed he was born into this world, one of those effortlessly rich men who grew up in houses with more bathrooms than people. The kind who never had to debate whether it was worth spending extra on name-brand cereal. But something about him didn't quite fit. Maybe it was the way he always carried himself, like he expected things to go wrong. Or the way he didn't flinch when she talked about struggling to pay bills. So when she saw an old, beat-up computer tower sitting on the corner of his office shelf, completely out of place among the modern tech, she pointed at it. What's with that? Leo, who had been typing away at his laptop, barely glanced up. It's a computer. Yeah, I figured, genius. But it looks ancient. What, did you start hacking the stock market at age 10? His fingers paused over the keyboard. He sat back, eyeing her like he was debating whether or not to answer. Finally, he exhaled. My dad built it. That was unexpected. She raised an eyebrow. Like, as a hobby? Leo reached for the tower, brushing a hand over the dusty surface. More like a necessity. He fixed computers to make ends meet. The kind of jobs no one else wanted. Half the time, people paid him in whatever they had, groceries, second-hand clothes, once even a lawnmower. Madeline blinked. And that worked? It kept the lights on. He shrugged. Most of the time. She studied him, trying to piece together the image. So, you didn't grow up with money? He gave her a dry look. No, Reyes. I did not grow up with money. Something about the way he said it made her hesitate before pushing further. Where was your mom? A flicker of something crossed his face. He looked away, setting the computer back down. She left when I was 5. Madeline winced. Sorry. He shrugged again, like it was old news. Maybe it was. It was just me and my dad after that. She let that sit for a second. And he taught you everything? Leo's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Everything worth knowing. Madeline leaned against the desk. So let me get this straight. You, the man who currently owns an entire tech empire, learned computers from a guy who got paid in lawnmowers? Basically. She shook her head. I bet that kills your investors. They don't know. That made her pause. You never told anyone? Why would I? She gestured around the office. I don't know, maybe because it's actually impressive? You worked your way up from nothing, and now you own a company that develops AI? She stopped herself before saying inspiring because she knew he'd hate that. Unexpected. He studied her for a moment. You think growing up poor makes me more likable? I think it makes you human, she said. Which, honestly, I was starting to question. Leo smirked. Careful, Reyes. That almost sounded like a compliment. Wouldn't want to start a trend. She watched as he looked back at the computer tower, something almost fond in his expression. And for the first time, she thought that maybe, just maybe, there was more to Leo Bennett than just the sharp edges he showed the world. Leo had spent years perfecting the art of not caring. It was an essential skill in his world: business, investments, technology. None of it worked if you got emotional. Feelings made people weak. Feelings made people reckless. Feelings were the reason he had spent most of his life focused on success, not connection. And yet, here he was, staring at a crayon drawing that had been left on the corner of his desk, wondering what the hell was happening to him. It had been slipped into his folder along with a stack of reports, likely by Madeline when she was distracted, not realizing she had handed him a masterpiece from a 6-year-old instead of her latest project notes. It was simple: 3 stick figures standing next to what was clearly supposed to be a rocket, with ME plus Mama plus space scrawled in the corner. He recognized Ivy's handwriting immediately. Something about it made his chest feel uncomfortably tight. He had never thought about kids before. Didn't hate them, didn't particularly like them, just hadn't thought about them. But Ivy was different. She was smart, stubborn, and deeply unimpressed by authority, traits he recognized far too well. She was a 6-year-old who believed she could go to space, no matter what anyone told her, because the idea of failure hadn't entered her mind yet. It reminded him of being a kid, sitting at his dad's workbench, surrounded by wires and broken motherboards, convinced that if he just took apart enough machines, he'd figure out how to build something great. He had been Ivy's age when his dad had handed him his first screwdriver and told him to open up an old computer and see what was inside. He had spent hours poking around, fascinated, asking 1,000 questions. His father had never once told him he was too young to understand. Ivy had that same determination, that same defiance. She wasn't waiting for permission to do something big. And Leo knew what happened to kids like that if no one stepped in to fight for them. He set the drawing aside and picked up the next file in his stack. It was a background report, something he had asked for when Madeline had started working for him, not because he was suspicious, but because he didn't like unknown variables. The report had been sitting in his inbox for days, unopened. He hadn't thought much about it until now. His eyes skimmed the page. Madeline Reyes. Age 29. Single mother. Late on rent, 3 months past due. A notice of eviction had been issued. He exhaled, jaw tightening. It shouldn't have been his problem. Except it was. Madeline didn't know how to ask for help, and if he offered, she'd probably fight him on it. She was too damn proud, and he respected that more than he cared to admit. So he made a call. The landlord sounded both thrilled and confused when Leo's assistant informed him that all outstanding balances would be paid immediately, no questions asked. The money was wired within minutes. Leo didn't mention it to Madeline. If she ever found out, he figured he'd deal with the fallout then. But for now, he just tucked Ivy's drawing into his desk and went back to pretending that he didn't care. Madeline had exactly $3.12 in her wallet when she stopped by her landlord's office, prepared for the usual argument. She had rehearsed the conversation in her head all morning: apologies, promises, the usual desperate negotiation tactics that had kept a roof over her head for the past few months. Maybe if she got another advance at work, maybe if she picked up a side gig on the weekends, maybe. But instead of the usual tight-lipped irritation, her landlord gave her a confused look the moment she walked in. "Did you need something?" Madeline hesitated. Yeah. My rent." You were threatening to evict me, remember? The landlord frowned. Ms. Reyes, your balance is paid in full. The words barely registered. She blinked. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, she stopped, the pieces snapping together at an alarming speed. There was only one person who had the money and the gall to do something like this without telling her. Leo. Her fingers curled into fists. Ms. Reyes, the landlord prompted. Madeline forced a tight smile. Right. Thanks. Then she turned and stormed out of the office, already pulling out her phone. Leo answered on the third ring, sounding completely unbothered. Reyes. You paid my rent. There was a pause. Then, good morning to you, too. Don't, she snapped, marching toward the street, her feet moving as fast as her pulse. You went behind my back and paid off my late fees. That's not. You're welcome. She nearly threw her phone at a passing bus. I'm not thanking you. That's a shame. It was a generous gesture. It was a controlling gesture. Same thing. She let out a sharp breath. I don't need charity, Bennett. It wasn't charity. It was an investment. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. Excuse me? You can't work properly if you're worried about losing your home. Now you don't have to worry. She clenched her teeth so hard her jaw ached. You do not get to decide what I worry about. You weren't handling it. That did it. She turned on her heel and stalked straight toward his office, cutting through traffic like a woman possessed. You smug, arrogant, overbearing. Careful, he said. You're about to run out of adjectives. She shoved open the lobby doors and stabbed the elevator button. You have no idea how insulting this is. You'd rather get evicted? I'd rather figure it out myself. Seems inefficient. She let out a frustrated noise, startling a man waiting next to her. The elevator doors slid open, and she stormed inside. I'm coming up. Already guessed that. When she arrived at his office, she didn't bother knocking. She threw the door open and pointed at him. You don't get to do this. Leo, perfectly calm, leaned back in his chair. I already did. Undo it. Not how transactions work. She let out a sharp breath, pacing. Do you know how humiliating it is to find out someone thinks you can't take care of yourself? His expression flickered. That's not what this was. That's exactly what this was. I don't think you're incapable, Reyes. I think you're stubborn to a fault. She crossed her arms. And you're not? Of course I am. That's why I win. She threw up her hands. This isn't a game. It is to me. She stared at him, half waiting for him to smirk, to say something cutting, to act like the smug billionaire she had gotten used to dealing with. But he didn't. He just watched her, like he was trying to figure something out, like maybe he had expected her to just take the money and move on. Why does this bother you so much? He asked. Because I don't need you. He tilted his head slightly. Are you trying to convince me or yourself? Her breath caught. For one awful, unbearable second, she didn't know the answer. Madeline had been forced to do a lot of things since she started working for Leo Bennett, test glitchy AI, figure out how to use an espresso machine that was probably smarter than her, pretend she wasn't wildly out of place in a world of billionaires and their very expensive problems. But nothing compared to this. The tech convention was enormous. High ceilings, glass walls, the kind of lighting that made everything look sleek and important. Every major company had set up elaborate displays showcasing their latest innovations: self-driving drones, AI-powered refrigerators, a robot dog that, for some reason, had eyebrows. It was the kind of event where everyone wore badges with words like founder and innovator, where egos filled the room faster than the complimentary champagne. Madeline's badge just said assistant. She tugged at the lanyard, feeling increasingly out of place. Explain to me again why I have to be here. Leo barely glanced at her as they walked toward the main conference hall. Because I need someone to take notes. You hate people. Why would you willingly go to an event with 1,000 of them? Because they hate me more. That, unfortunately, sounded exactly right. They hadn't even made it through the first aisle before someone called his name. A man with a too-perfect suit and the smirk of someone who had never had to carry his own groceries stepped into their path. Leo, the man said, extending his hand. Didn't expect to see you here. Thought you preferred to send your minions. Leo shook his hand, but his expression was already edging toward boredom. Patrick. Patrick. Madeline had heard the name before, Patrick Hayes, CEO of Titan Systems, a direct competitor of Leo's company. They had been rivals for years, though from what she had gathered, it wasn't an even fight. Leo had the brains, Patrick had the marketing team. Patrick's gaze flicked to Madeline, and his smirk widened. Ah. And who's this? Before she could introduce herself, he made a thoughtful sound. Oh, wait, don't tell me. The infamous charity case. Her stomach tightened. Leo's expression didn't change. Excuse me? Come on, Patrick said, gesturing toward Madeline like she was an accessory. Everyone's been talking about it. Leo Bennett, the reclusive genius, suddenly hires an assistant with no experience? People were wondering if you lost a bet. Madeline forced herself to smile. No bet. Just unparalleled charm. Patrick laughed, but it was the kind of laugh people did when they thought they were being humored. It's cute, really. A good PR move. Humanizes you. Madeline could feel Leo tense beside her, but she wasn't about to let some overgroomed tech bro talk about her like she wasn't in the room. She tilted her head. That's interesting. Do you have an assistant, Patrick? Of course. And does he know how to use your software, or is he too busy making your coffee? Patrick blinked. She smiled sweetly. See, that's the difference. Leo hires people who actually contribute. You just hire people who don't make you feel threatened. Leo made a quiet sound that almost, sounded like a laugh. Patrick recovered quickly, but his smirk was a little less sure now. Well, he said, adjusting his cuffs, good luck with that. If you ever need a real job, call me. Madeline grinned. I'd rather set myself on fire. Leo didn't say anything until Patrick walked away. Then he looked at her, head tilted slightly. You handled that well. She dusted off her hands. Was that my real job, or do I still have to take notes? Leo smirked. Let's call it multitasking. Madeline wasn't the kind of person who let herself get distracted. She didn't have time for it. Between work, Ivy, and making sure she wasn't one missed paycheck away from catastrophe, she had mastered the art of compartmentalizing. Feelings, especially the inconvenient kind, were things she locked away for later, except later never actually came. But Leo Bennett was making that increasingly difficult. It wasn't just that he was attractive, though that was an undeniable problem. It was the way he listened when she talked, even when she was sure he wasn't paying attention. The way he had started keeping a stash of fruit snacks in his office because he knew Ivy liked them. The way he somehow managed to be both maddening and thoughtful in the same breath. She was falling for him. And it was a disaster. Because his world wasn't hers. He lived in high-rise apartments with floor-to-ceiling windows and automated everything. She lived in a cramped walk-up where the heat only worked when it felt like it. He made decisions that changed industries. She made decisions based on which grocery store had the best discount on eggs. He was temporary. He had to be. She knew all of this, had repeated it to herself so many times it should have sunk in. But then Ivy had to go and say that. They were walking home from the park, Ivy skipping beside her, sticky from ice cream and sunshine. Leo is nice, Ivy said casually. Madeline hummed. Sure. And he's really smart. Emichim. And rich. Madeline glanced down, narrowing her eyes. Why do I feel like you're building up to something? Ivy shrugged. I was just wondering if he's my new dad. Madeline nearly tripped over her own feet. What? Ivy stopped skipping, looking up at her with big, innocent eyes. Is he? No. No, he's my boss. Ivy considered this. But you like him. Madeline's face burned. That is not relevant. Ivy wasn't convinced. I think he likes you too. Madeline groaned. No more ice cream for you. It's making you weird. But Ivy just grinned, like she knew something Madeline didn't. And the worst part? She probably did. Leo was losing his mind. That was the only explanation. He had spent years avoiding unnecessary attachments, carefully constructing a life that was efficient, logical, and most importantly, his. No one asked him for anything. No one expected anything from him. That was how he liked it. And yet, here he was, inviting Madeline and Ivy to his private retreat like some kind of sentimental idiot. He told himself it was practical. Ivy had never been out of the city, and the estate had acres of open space, an infinity pool, a home theater, and, more importantly, a fully automated smart house with enough cutting-edge technology to make anyone, especially a 6-year-old, lose their mind. She'd love it. That was all this was. That was the lie he told himself, at least. Madeline, of course, was skeptical. You want me to bring my 6-year-old to a house full of expensive technology? She asked, arms crossed. Leo leaned against his desk. It's child-proofed. Madeline snorted. Nothing is child-proofed. It'll be fine. She studied him, suspicious. And why exactly are you doing this? He had anticipated this question. Because you've been working hard, and I'm rewarding your efforts. Her eyes narrowed. You've never rewarded my efforts before. Because I'm evolving as a person. Aha. He folded his arms. Ivy would like it. Madeline sighed, already caving. Which was how they ended up driving out of the city, Ivy bouncing excitedly in the back seat, asking a million questions. When they arrived, Ivy immediately declared the house better than a castle and ran off to explore, leaving Madeline and Leo alone in the kitchen. She glanced around, pretending not to be impressed. You live here? Not really. I come here when I need space. She rolled her eyes. Of course you do. He leaned against the counter, watching her. And what exactly does that mean? She smirked. It means you're the kind of guy who owns an entire retreat for when you're feeling overwhelmed, while the rest of us just take a walk around the block. He smirked back. You could take a walk here. She sighed dramatically. Fine, I admit it. This place is obscene in the best possible way. Glad to hear it. Later, after Ivy had exhausted herself running through the gardens, Madeline wandered onto the deck, watching the sun dip below the trees. Leo joined her, hands in his pockets. You're thinking too hard. She glanced at him. You don't know what I'm thinking. Sure I do. He looked at her, really looked at her. You're trying to convince yourself you don't like being here. She swallowed, pulse unsteady. That's not true. Okay. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a dare. Just a quiet understanding. She turned to say something, but he was closer than she expected, his eyes locked on hers, and suddenly, the air between them changed. Her breath hitched. For a second, just a second, she could see it happening. And then she stepped back. His expression didn't change, but she caught the flicker of something in his eyes, something that looked dangerously close to disappointment. She cleared her throat. I should check on Ivy. Leo nodded once. Right. She turned and walked inside, ignoring the way her heart was hammering. This was a terrible idea. Madeline wasn't eavesdropping. Not intentionally, anyway. She had been wandering the office looking for coffee, real coffee, not the oat milk-infused nonsense the tech people insisted on drinking, when she heard Leo's voice coming from the conference room. The door was cracked open just enough for her to catch a few words. She wasn't planning to stop. She really wasn't. But then she heard job cuts and automation in the same sentence, and her feet betrayed her before her brain could stop them. Inside, Leo sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, listening as one of his executives laid out a plan with far too much enthusiasm for someone explaining how hundreds of people were about to lose their paychecks. By implementing full AI integration, the man said, clicking through his overly polished presentation, we can eliminate the need for most of our entry-level workforce. Efficiency will increase, and long-term costs will drop significantly. Madeline's stomach twisted. The man kept going, tossing out phrases like profit margins and strategic workforce restructuring, but all she heard was people losing their jobs. Real people. People like her. She pushed open the door without thinking. Are you serious? The room went silent. Leo barely blinked. Reyes. She planted herself in the doorway. So let me get this straight. You're just going to replace actual human employees with AI because it's cheaper? The executive frowned. This is a closed meeting. Leo held up a hand, silencing him. Keep going, Reyes. She crossed her arms. I thought this company was about innovation. About progress. Since when does progress mean screwing over the people who built this place? The executive scoffed. Technology evolves. So does business. Oh, does it? Tell that to the single parents on your payroll who won't be able to evolve when you pull their paychecks. Leo watched her, unreadable. You have a better idea? Yeah. How about not firing people? The executive huffed. That's not realistic. Madeline turned to Leo. You started from nothing. You were one of these people once. Are you really okay with this? Something flickered in his expression. The executive cut in before Leo could respond. This company isn't a charity. It's about efficiency. Madeline's hands clenched. And what's efficient about losing the trust of the people who actually make this place run? Leo leaned back in his chair, considering her. We'll discuss this later. She narrowed her eyes. Promise? His lips twitched. Promise. She held his gaze for another second before turning and walking out. Leo exhaled, drumming his fingers against the table. Sir, the executive started, you're not actually reconsidering. Leo raised an eyebrow. The man promptly shut up. Leo had built his entire career on logic. Numbers, projections, efficiency, those were the things that made sense. Not emotions. Not feelings. Not people storming into boardrooms accusing him of ruining lives just because he was making a smart business decision. And yet, here he was, watching Madeline pace his office like she was deciding whether to punch him or quit. You're really going through with it, she said, arms crossed so tightly it looked painful. I haven't made a final decision, he said. You didn't shut it down, she shot back. Which means you're thinking about it. Which means you're going through with it, you're just waiting for the best way to spin it. Leo exhaled, keeping his voice level. It's a business decision, Reyes. Yeah? And what about the people it affects? People adapt. Her eyes flashed. Not everyone can just adapt, Leo. You know that better than anyone. He pushed back from his desk, standing. If I ran this company based on sentiment, it would collapse. And if you strip it down to nothing but numbers, what's left? Profit, he said, deliberately, because he knew it would set her off. It did. Her hands clenched at her sides. Right. Of course. Because all that matters is the bottom line. Not loyalty, not integrity, just profit. It's what keeps people employed, he said. She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. Not people. Computers. AI. That's all you're going to have left when you're done replacing actual human beings. Leo didn't say anything. He could have argued, could have reminded her that automation was inevitable, that every industry evolved, that if his company didn't move forward, someone else would. But something in the way she was looking at him made him hesitate. Like she had expected better from him. The thought sat uncomfortably in his chest. She let out a hollow laugh. You know what? I don't even know why I'm arguing. This isn't my problem. He frowned. What does that mean? It means I quit. The words hit harder than he expected. You're overreacting, he said. She laughed again, but there was no humor in it. Of course you think that. Because nothing about this matters to you. That's not true, he said, before thinking. She looked at him. Then prove it. He hesitated. And that was her answer. She grabbed her bag and walked out. Madeline had walked away from jobs before. It was what you did when they stopped paying you, or when your manager screamed at you for things outside of your control, or when you realized the place you worked was never going to give you anything more than exhaustion. But this was different. She hadn't just walked away from a paycheck. She had walked away from the only real opportunity she had ever been given. From something that had, against all odds, made her want to succeed. From Leo. Which was stupid, because he was just a guy. A frustrating, arrogant, brilliant guy who had let her in just enough to make her think he might actually care. But at the end of the day, he was still a billionaire who would always put business first. Ivy took it the hardest. Why don't you work for Leo anymore? She asked over dinner, poking at her macaroni. Madeline forced a smile. Because sometimes grown-ups decide to do different things. Ivy frowned. Did he fire you? No, baby. Then why'd you leave? Madeline hesitated. Ivy's lower lip wobbled. I miss him. She closed her eyes briefly, willing herself not to feel guilty. I know, sweetheart. That night, after Ivy fell asleep, Madeline stared at the ceiling, wondering if she had made a mistake. Leo told himself it was for the best. She had been a complication. A distraction. And now things were back to normal. But he couldn't stop thinking about her. About the way she never backed down, the way she challenged him, the way she looked at him like he wasn't just numbers and strategy, like he was more than that, even when he didn't deserve it. And he hated how much he missed it. Missed her. Madeline had just put Ivy to bed when she heard the knock. It was late, too late for a neighbor, and definitely too late for a delivery. The last time someone had knocked this late, it had been her landlord with a warning about overdue rent, but that wasn't a problem anymore. Thanks to Leo. She wiped her hands on her pajama pants, muttering to herself as she crossed the room. If this is another guy trying to sell me a security system, I swear. She swung the door open and froze. Leo stood in the hallway, looking as wildly out of place in her building as he had the first time he showed up. His suit jacket was gone, his sleeves rolled up, and his usual carefully maintained exterior was cracked around the edges. He looked uneasy. Which was interesting, considering she was the one currently experiencing mild cardiac arrest. She crossed her arms. Did you get lost on your way to an actual penthouse? His mouth twitched, but the usual arrogance wasn't there. Can I come in? Madeline considered slamming the door in his face. She really did. But she stepped aside anyway. He walked in, glancing around the small apartment like it held the answer to something. She let him look. Let him take in the crayon drawings taped to the fridge, the stack of overdue library books, the mess of stuffed animals Ivy had left on the couch. Then he turned to her. "I was wrong," he said simply. She exhaled sharply. "Which part?" "All of it." She leaned against the counter. "Gonna need a little more than that." He ran a hand through his hair. "I thought I could just move on. That if you weren't in my life, things would go back to the way they were before." She tilted her head. "And?" "They didn't." The words hung between them, heavier than she expected. He stepped closer. "I don't want you to come back to work for me." Her heart clenched, but she forced herself to nod. "I figured. I want you to come back with me." She blinked. "What?" "As my partner," he said. "Not my assistant. Not someone working for me, but with me. On your terms." She stared at him. "Madeline. You don't do partnerships," she said, voice quieter than she meant. "I do now," he said simply. Something inside her wavered. Leo had always been impossible to read, a fortress of logic and control, but right now, standing in her tiny apartment, he looked like a man who had figured out exactly what he wanted. And it was her. She exhaled, her walls crumbling faster than she could rebuild them. "You're really bad at apologies, you know that?" He smirked, just a little. "I'm aware." She shook her head, fighting a smile. Then she reached for his hand. And just like that, everything changed.